So as we get into this video about Jason Todd, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be splitting this video up into three segments. The first part of the video is going to focus on the pre-Crisis on Infinite Earth's origin and stories of Jason Todd. The second part is going to focus on the post-Crisis Jason Todd, and the third part is going to focus on the New 52. So Jason Todd's introduction to us in DC Comics actually comes as part of a six-part crossover between Batman and Detective Comics. Now with Detective Comics, he appeared in Detective Comics issues number 524 through 526. And with Batman Volume 1, it was issues 357 to 359. And the way that Jason Todd is given to us is actually really interesting here. He was initially created by Jerry Conway and Don Newton, and Les Daniels, a comic book historian, when he was writing about this in his book Batman the Complete History, what he tells us is that when Dick Grayson had become Robin, he had been Robin for so long that the character Robin had basically become an intrinsic part of the Batman continuity. And so as a result, with DC experimenting with moving Dick Grayson away, having Dick Grayson become his own superhero who would later on become Nightwing, DC was trying to find a way to basically bring back the concept of Robin, to provide this element that had been lacking in Batman comics and ultimately began to, contribute to the decline in readership of Batman comics. And so with the arrival of Jason Todd, what we found was that initially DC fans absolutely hated him. And the reason for this is because the origins of Jason Todd, as are given to us, are almost identical to the origins of Dick Grayson. Dick Grayson, of course, as we had discussed in our video, was the son of acrobats, the Flying Graysons, who were killed when the circus owner refused to pay protection money to a local mob boss. Jason Todd was almost the exact same way. The only difference here was that Killer Croc was initially given to us as the person that had killed Jason Todd's parents, which coincidentally, this actually includes the first appearance of Killer Croc in Batman comics. But the fact remains that because it appeared to DC fans that DC was trying to make a mirror image of Dick Grayson in the form of Jason Todd and then throw it onto DC fans, they despised him again almost upon his initial creation. Now over time, over the course of the next few years, what we found was that that Jason Todd would develop a fan base of sorts, but that ultimately we would see this fan base split down the middle and see just how divided the fan base was when it came to Jason Todd in terms of whether or not he should live or he should die when we get to the story of the death in the family. But what we do here is we begin to transition into the post-crisis world of of Jason Todd. The reason being because this is when we start to see Jason Todd really step into his own, really kind of become more of an interesting character, and eventually we'll see this begin to unfold largely when we get into the New 52 era and even some of the events before the New 52, where we look at him undertaking the role of the Red Hood. So as we know, with 1985, we saw the Crisis on Infinite Earths in the DC continuity. And what DC was basically doing with the Crisis on Infinite Earths is they were looking at their various lineups, various characters, and they were trying to find a way to revamp them in a way that would make them more appealing to comic book readers. And so what we found was that with his introduction post-Crisis, that what they had done is they had gone back and they had said that Killer Croc was not the person that had murdered his parents, that instead his parents were murdered by Two-Face. And to a degree, this found some resonance among comic book fans. To a degree, people were sort of beginning to get on board with Jason Todd because now what they saw DC doing was listening to the fans and saying, okay, if this original version of Jason Todd isn't successful, then let's try this new one and see how it works out. And this is when we start to see the fan base of Jason Todd grow a little bit. But ultimately, the vocal people were still there. The vocal concept of Jason Todd not being well received was still there. And so what DC did is in 1988, they gave us the death in the family. Now, what they also did here is they basically left it to the fans to decide whether or not Jason Todd should live or die. This is one of the most popular elements of Jason Todd's continuity. What DC did is they set up a 1-900 number, and they gave fans the opportunity to call in and to decide whether or not Jason Todd should live or die. And by a very slim margin of about 100 votes or so, which ended up being 5,343 in support of Jason Todd dying and 5,271 against Jason Todd dying, what we found was that DC killed Jason Todd off. And again, this was a massive moment in the history of DC continuity, and the reason why was because this again basically began to solidify the concept in comic books of this triumvirate of sorts. That is to say, in the realm of comic books, there are only three characters that stay dead. The first is Uncle Ben, the second is Bucky Barnes, and the third is Jason Todd. And so what we would find going going forward with this post-crisis continuity is that Jason Todd would remain absent from DC Comics for almost 15 years. We would never actually see him in any real form or fashion, with the exception of flashbacks. But all this changed around 2000 or so when we saw the introduction of a storyline called Hush. Now, with Jeff Loeb and Jim Lee's Hush, this of course was a story that was based on a villain whose identity hadn't been revealed at the beginning of the story, but who was basically, bringing all the villains of Batman together for the purpose of launching this sort of psychological and physical warfare against Batman. But what we saw was that as the stories began to progress, as the series continued to move forward, that periodically there would be these hints and drops from time to time of Jason Todd. And so in issue number 617, which came out in 2003, again 15 years after Death in the Family, where Jason Todd had been killed, we had seen a scenario whereby Jason Todd had held the new version of Robin, Tim Drake, hostage and was preparing to kill him in front of Batman. Now, this revelation to comic book fans, to DC fans, was mind-blowing. This was huge. This is one of the biggest moments in the history of Batman and DC continuity overall. And the reason for this is because, again, this was basically the possibility existing that DC would bring back Jason Todd. This was the possibility existing that all those people who grew up with Jason Todd and then had to watch him die could see the character come back again. But what we found was that in an interview with Newsrama, that Jeff Loeb had come out and said that he had no real intention of bringing back Jason Todd. The reason being because he had always felt that Jason Todd dying was really this motivation to keep Batman doing what it was that he was doing. They kept giving Batman this motivation to constantly fight crime, that the loss of his parents was one of the greatest losses of his experience, but the loss of Jason Todd was really his biggest failure here. But because of the fan reaction to Jason Todd, because so many fans were absolutely excited to see the possibility of Jason Todd returning, DC didn't really have a choice here. DC really kind of had their hand forced in this situation, and so ultimately what we saw was that Jason Todd would return to DC Comics under the continuity or under the story of a 6-part limited series called Batman Under the Red Hood. Now, where Batman Under the Red Hood basically gave us this story whereby Jason Todd had returned to Gotham City operating under the mantle of the Red Hood, what we're actually going to do is we're going to sidestep this for a second and we're going to jump to 2010. And the reason we're going to jump to 2010 is because what Judd Winnick had done is he had given us a story called Red Hood: The Lost Days. And what this did is it basically gave us how it was things had progressed. It told us what happened between the time that Jason Todd had basically been killed during Death in the Family, and how it was that he had come back to life, or how it was he had basically undertaken this mantle. Now, initially, the story doesn't really tell us how it was he had come back to life. That's actually covered in Batman Annual number 25. And with Batman Annual number 25, what's told to us is that when Superboy Prime was trying to punch his way out of the Paradise Dimension, a ramification of this, or a ripple effect of this, was that Jason Todd was simply just revived. DC doesn't really tell us why. DC doesn't really tell us how this happened. They don't tell us how it was that this happened in the first place. It simply just takes place. It's just their way of kind of shoehorning in why it is that Jason Todd had returned to life. But again, going back into Red Hood: The Lost Days, what we find is that once Jason Todd begins to wake up, once he basically digs himself out of his grave, this story picks up with him when Talia al Ghul becomes aware of the fact that Jason Todd is alive. Now again, Jason Todd is not the biological child of Talia al Ghul, but Talia al Ghul's rationale, at least as far as it's drawn out by her father, is that if she is able to basically rehabilitate Jason Todd, who at this moment is really more of in a comatose state or kind of a walking zombie than anything else, that if she rehabilitates him and takes him back to Batman, that Batman will probably love her. And so what happens is that she basically takes Jason Todd back to her home, and she begins to, I guess again, try to rehabilitate him, try to get him back into functioning normally. And so ultimately, as time begins to progress, Jason Todd sort of begins to come to a degree, but ultimately this is really more of a circumstance where Jason Todd is maybe a victim of the Lazarus Pits. What I mean by that is, as far as we know with the Lazarus Pits of Ra's al Ghul, that when someone is put into the Lazarus Pit, they are effectively healed of any wounds, and they are granted an extension to their existing life. But a side effect of this is that they simply become mad. And so this is what appears to have happened with Jason Todd, that with Talia al Ghul unable to effectively bring him out of this comatose state, that she throws him into the Lazarus pit. And as a result, he begins to sort of breathe anew, at least as far as Jason Todd describes it. It's like waking up out of a dream, but instead of being rational, he's more of a madman. Now, he's not necessarily insane on the level of the Joker, but at this point in time, his mindset is to basically kill Batman. And the reason why is because from the Red Hood's perspective, from Jason Todd's perspective, if Batman truly cared about him, Batman would have killed the Joker in retaliation for the Joker killing Jason Todd. But Batman hadn't done that. Not only had Batman not done that, Batman had undertaken another Robin. He had undertaken Tim Drake. And so from Jason Todd's perspective, it seemed as though Batman had simply just moved forward and didn't really care that much about Jason Todd at all. And so again, under this story of the Lost Years, the Lost Days, what we find is that we learn Jason Todd was effectively sort of, maybe stalled by Talia al Ghul, but the way that she had done this was by making him a deadlier person, which seems a little strange, but she had basically sent him to various tutors, people that taught him and capitalized on the lessons he had learned from Bruce Wayne. Now, they didn't know that he was Jason Todd and that he was taught by Bruce Wayne. All they knew was that he had a prodigious set of skills in terms of basic chemistry, in terms of physical combat, and weapons use. What these mentors did was expand on those capabilities, turning Jason Todd into one of the foremost assassins in the world. But over the course of the story, what we also found was that Jason Todd began to realize that a lot of these mentors were involved in some rather unsavory acts, that one of the mentors that taught him, enhanced hand-to-hand combat tactics was involved in the child sex slave ring. What we also found was that one of the other individuals who had taught him how to make bombs was tied with the Russian mob, and their intention was to basically divert the intelligence agencies of Britain away from the Russian mob by detonating several bombs over, around London, and then blaming it on Arabic extremists. These are the kinds of schemes that his mentors had in store for themselves. And so what Jason Todd began to do was effectively learn what he needed to learn and then kill off these mentors. And so ultimately, as time progressed, he began to develop this mindset whereby he lost interest in killing Batman. It wasn't necessarily the drive to kill Batman. And once Talia al Ghul had asked him what his motive was, what it is he wanted to achieve by traveling back to Gotham, he said he really wasn't quite sure here. And so what Talia al Ghul said is that he can be a better Batman than Bruce Wayne, that his motivation should be to travel back to Gotham City to usurp the role of Batman from Bruce Wayne and then effectively take over that role for himself, which we'll see begin to kind of take shape to a degree with the Battle for the Cowl. Now, the Battle for the Cowl was a short-lived series as far as Jason Todd was concerned. All we had found here was that Jason Todd had arrived in Gotham, he had adopted the role or tried to adopt the role of Batman and was almost immediately subdued by Dick Grayson by Nightwing. And as a result, Jason Todd began to move away from this ideology. But all this really began to also coincide with the New 52. And so this was really all just kind of rushed together, kind of packed together very, very tightly. The stories were put together so fast, there really wasn't a whole lot of time for us to think as readers, or even for DC to effectively close out the continuity properly. And so what we found was that with the New 52 rebooting everything, that we step into a new era of Jason Todd, whereby Jason Todd is a member of the group called the Red Hood and the Outlaws. Now, with the New 52, DC came back and changed a lot of things when it came to Jason Todd. Not only that, they actually streamlined and simplified a lot of things. The initial skepticism of this really sort of came to an end with Death of the Family, and of course we'll get into that as we continue with our stories in Batman. But ultimately, with New 52, we saw Jason Todd stepping into this new role of being a character who didn't undergo training with regards to a multitude of different mentors, but instead was trained by a group called the All-Cast. We learned that instead of him coming back to life as a result of Superboy Prime trying to punch his way out of the Paradise Dimension, that instead his body was simply taken by Talia al Ghul and thrown into the Lazarus pits. And so again, this was just a way for DC to come back and to simplify everything regarding Jason Todd, to basically take all this pre-crisis and post-crisis continuity and to wrap it all up and to make it very easy for those who were getting into DC Comics during New 52 to basically look at the character character of Jason Todd and to see a very simplified version. But again, not getting too deep into the New 52 here, because we're going to be talking about a lot of these stories with regards to our build-up to Convergence and our discussion on the Batman continuity. What we know is that once Convergence comes to an end, that Red Hood and the Outlaws is going to be one of the stories that's going to be canceled. Now, we don't know if DC is going to get rid of Red Hood entirely, although that's highly unlikely. What we do know is that Red Hood will most likely be undergoing another role here. He'll be playing some different kind of position with regards to his placement in the DC continuity. But again, this is all just sort of speculation here. We're not 100% sure about a lot of this stuff. With that being said, we're going to go ahead and bring this video to an end. I know this was a rough one. Jason Todd was really kind of a difficult character to get done, but I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, let me know, and I will catch you guys later. Peace. Be sure to follow me on Twitter. There you can keep up with all the updates from Comics Explained and talk to me directly.